Hello everyone, and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of my new podcast, Unanswered Questions, where every week we'll endeavour to discuss a mysterious unsolved case that has many lingering unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoy, and as always, leave me some feedback on what you think about the show, and rate it as well. Now on to the show. This week we're talking about the Operation Northwoods conspiracy. Operation Northwoods was a proposed false flag operation that originated within the US Department of Defense of the United States government in 1962. The proposals called for CIA operatives to both stage and commit acts of terrorism against American military and civilian targets, blame them on the Cuban government, and would be used to justify war against Cuba. The possibilities detailed in the document included the remote control of civilian aircraft, which would be secretly repainted as US Air Force planes, a fabricated shoot-down of a US Air Force fighter aircraft off the coast of Cuba, the possible assassination of Cuban immigrants, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, blowing up a US ship, and orchestrating terrorism in US cities. Thankfully, the proposals were rejected by President John F. Kennedy, which is another case I will cover in another episode of my podcast, particularly surrounding his assassination and that of his brother Robert F. Kennedy. Fidel Castro, again, another podcast episode I will do later on the many assassination attempts on his life, had taken power in Cuba in 1959 and began allowing communists into the new Cuban government, nationalizing US businesses and improving relations with the Soviet Union, arousing the concern of the US military due to the Cold War. The operation proposed creating public support for a war against Cuba by blaming the Cuban government for terrorist acts that would be perpetrated by the US government. To this end, Operation Northwoods proposals recommended hijackings and bombings, followed by the introduction of false evidence that would implicate the Cuban government. It stated, and I quote, "The desired result from the execution of this plan would be to place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba, and to develop an international image of a Cuban threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere." Several other proposals were included within Operation Northwoods, including real or simulated actions against various US military and civilian targets. The operation recommended developing a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, which involved the bombing of civilian targets, which was to be blamed on the Cuban government to paint a false image of Fidel Castro and misinform the American public. End quote. The plan was drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by Chairman, and I'm going to butcher this name, Lyman Lemitsa, and sent to the Secretary of Defense. Although part of the US government's anti-communist Cuban project, Operation Northwoods was never officially accepted. It was authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but then rejected by President Kennedy. None of the false flag operations became active under the auspices of the Operation Northwoods proposals. Now we get into the origins and public release of this plan. The main Operations Northwoods proposal was presented in a document titled, and I quote, "Justification for US Military Intervention in Cuba, TS," end quote. A top-secret collection of draft memoranda written by the Department of Defense, DoD, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS. The document was presented by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on the 13th of March 1962 as a preliminary submission for planning purposes. The Joint Chiefs recommended that both the covert and overt aspects of any such operation be assigned to them. The previously secret document was originally made public on the 18th of November 1997 by the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, a U.S. federal agency overseeing the release of government records related to the John F. Kennedy assassination. A total of 1,521 pages of once secret military records covering 1962 to 1964 were concomitantly declassified by said review board. I'm so sorry for getting that word wrong. Appendix to Enclosure A and Annex to Appendix to Enclosure A of the Northwoods documents were first published online by the National Security Archive on the 6th of November 1998 in a joint venture with CNN as part of its 1998 Cold War television documentary series, specifically as a documentation supplement to Episode 10 Cuba, which aired on the 29th of November 1998. Annex to Appendix to Enclosure A is the section of the document which contains the proposals to stage false flag terrorist attacks. The Northwoods document was published online in a more complete form, including cover memoranda by the National Security Archive on the 30th of April 2001. Now we get into the provocations. In response to a request for pretext for military intervention by the Joint Chief of Operations of the Cuba Project, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, the document listed methods including false flag provocations and outlined plans that the authors believed would garner public and international support for US military intervention in Cuba. According to the documents, the plan called for several steps to be taken in an attempt to provoke Cuba into an action against the United States, then blame it for hostilities carried out by the US against its military base at Guantanamo. These would be followed by executing offensive operations there against tactical Cuban civilian targets and military emplacements, leading to large-scale United States military operations. 1. Since it would seem desirable to use legitimate provocation as the basis for US military intervention in Cuba, a cover and deception plan to include a requisite preliminary action such as had been developed in response to Task 33C could be executed as an initial effort to provoke Cuban reactions. Harassment plus deceptive actions to convince the Cubans of imminent invasion would be emphasized. Our military posture throughout execution of the plan will follow a rapid change from exercise to intervention if Cuban response justifies. 2. A series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. 3. The United States would respond by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying military and mortar emplacements which threaten the base. 4. Commence large-scale United States military operations. End quote. Now we get into how this is related to the Operation Mongoose proposals. In addition to Operation Northwoods, under the Operation Mongoose program, which I'm going to cover in a separate podcast episode, the US Department of Defense had a number of similar proposals for actions to be taken against the Cuban regime of Fidel Castro. 12 of these proposals came from a 2nd of February 1962 memorandum entitled, quote, Possible Actions to Provoke, Harass, or Disrupt Cuba, end quote, written by Brigadier General William H. Craig and submitted to Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, the commander of the Operation Mongoose project. The memorandum outlines Operation Bingo, a false flag plan to create an incident which has the appearance of an attack on US facilities, GMO, in Cuba, thus providing an excuse for use of US military might to overthrow the current government of Cuba. It also includes Operation Dirty Trick, another false flag plot to blame Castro if the 1962 Mercury crewed spaceflight carrying John Glenn crashed, saying the objective is to provide irrevocable proof that should the Mercury manned orbit flight fail, the fault lies with the communist et al. Cuba, end quote. It continues, quote, this to be accomplished by manufacturing various pieces of evidence which would prove electronic interference on the part of the Cubans, end quote. Even after General Lemitsa lost his job as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Chiefs still planned false flag pretext operations at least into 1963. A different US Department of Defense policy paper created in 1963 discussed a plan to make it to appear that Cuba had attacked a member of the Organization of American States, OAS, so that the United States could retaliate. The US Department of Defense document says of one of the scenarios, quote, a contrived Cuban attack on an OAS member could be set up and the attacked state could be urged to take measures of self-defense and request assistance from the US and OAS, end quote. The plan expressed confidence by this action, quote, the US could almost certainly obtain the necessary 2/3 support among OAS members for collective action against Cuba, end quote. Included in the nations, the Joint Chiefs suggested as targets for covert attacks were Jamaica and Trinidad Tobago. Since both were members of the British Commonwealth, the Joint Chiefs hoped that by secretly attacking them and then falsely blaming Cuba, the United States could incite the people of the United Kingdom into supporting a war against Castro. As the US Department of Defense report noted, quote, any of the contrived situations described above are inherently extremely risky in our democratic system in which security can be maintained, after the fact with very great difficulty. If the decision should be made to set up a contrived situation, it should be one in which participation by US personnel is limited only to the most highly trusted covert personnel. This suggests the infeasibility of the use of military units for any aspect of the contrived situation. End quote. The US Department of Defense report even suggested covertly paying a person in Castro's government to stage a false flag attack against the United States. Quote, the only area remaining for consideration then would be to bribe one of Castro's subordinate commanders to initiate an attack on the US Navy base at Guantanamo. End quote. Now we come to the reaction. Kennedy rejected the Northwoods proposal, a JCS/Pentagon document, a memo by Lansdale entitled, quote, Meeting with the President, 16th of March 1962, reads, and I quote, General Lemitzer commented that the military had contingency plans for US intervention. Also, it had plans for creating plausible pretext to use force with the pretext either attacks on US aircraft or a Cuban action in Latin America for which we could retaliate. The President said bluntly that we were not discussing the use of military force, that General Lemitzer might find the US so engaged in Berlin or elsewhere that he couldn't use the contemplated 4 divisions in Cuba. End quote. The proposal was sent for approval to the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, but was not implemented. Following the presentation of the Northwoods plan, Kennedy removed Lemitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although he became Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in January of 1963. US military leaders began to perceive Kennedy as going soft on Cuba, and the president became increasingly unpopular with the military. A rift had already developed during Kennedy's disagreements with the service chiefs over the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, and flared up again with his June 10, 1963 announcement of a unilateral US test ban treaty. Physical documentation on Operation Northwoods became declassified through the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. This act declassified a total of 4 million documents, including Operation Northwoods, and was made available through the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. However, public knowledge of Operation Northwoods did not come until 2001, with the release of a book by the author James Bamford titled Body of Secrets. On the 3rd of August 2001, the National Assembly of People's Power of Cuba, the main legislative body of the Republic of Cuba, issued a statement referring to Operation Northwoods and Operation Mongoose, wherein it condemned such US government plans. With that, this case remains open, but with many unanswered questions that still remain unanswered. Please rate the show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions Podcast. Until next time. Next on Unanswered Questions. Hulk Hogan remains one of the most popular pro wrestlers in the world of professional wrestling, with his influence in the business never being understated. However, his troubled past concerning racism has ultimately led to his downfall. Even though Hogan has been in and around the wrestling business, he's been known to stretch the truth once in a while.